Welcome, everyone. I'm Pirooz Karim, Director of the Center for Iranian Diaspora Studies, and I want to welcome everyone and thank you for joining us today. I have been mindful of the land acknowledgement because we just had Earth Day, and I was thinking about the land acknowledgement in the light of your film, Pirooz, that it's about acknowledging people who've been erased and omitted from our own history. So I'm going to read the campus land acknowledgement. San Francisco State is on the San Francisco Peninsula and North Bay, and it's within the occupied territories of the Ramaytush, Ohlone, and the coastal Miwok, who along with the Southern Pomo are organized as the Federated Indians of Granton Rancheria. And last week when we did our Earth Day event, I had the good fortune of telling people that across the street from Ashby, where I live, close to where I live, a community garden was recently bought by an anonymous donor for $450,000 and returned to the Ohlone people who are from the Bay Area. So I thought it was so cool to even acknowledge the Ohlone people in today's program because of how much your film is about acknowledging past wounds. So
absolutely, and it's so interesting that you read that, because as I was making the film, I was actually thinking a lot about Dances with Wolves and other films like that, and I said to myself, I hope I can make something that honors the Iranian diaspora like that film did for Native Americans. Yeah.
Thank you. Today's event also is in collaboration with the Center for Iranian Diaspora Studies and the San Francisco State School of Cinema. And I have to thank my colleague, Mayuran Tichurvelam, who's the George and Judy Marcus Endowed Chair in Social Justice Fiction Filmmaking. He wanted to be with us because this film is right up his alley, but unfortunately he couldn't be with us. But it's because of him that we had a co-sponsor for this program today. So welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us. In case you didn't know, May is National Mental Health Awareness Month, and we're grateful to put this film in the context of both National Mental Health Awareness Month and also in the context of Iranian diaspora studies, because it's indicative of the struggles around trauma, mental wellness, and reckoning with the effects of history, bigotry, and racism that exist in our country and are pervasive still. And I hope that everybody who's with us got to see the film, and we are today engaging in a conversation with the filmmaker Pirooz Kalayeh as he attempts to tackle important issues that are germane not just to Iranian Americans, but to Americans as a whole and to diaspora communities specifically. And I want to congratulate Pirooz for his recent award, because Sometimes I Dream in Farsi just won the Best Feature Documentary at the Ctrl Film Series in New York City last week. So congratulations to you.
Thank you so much.
And then I'm going to introduce our two speakers. We're going to let them kind of engage in a conversation. And then if there's time afterwards, we want to invite the audience to ask questions as well. And we can do it both in the chat, and I'll sort of monitor any questions that come up in the chat, or if you want to raise your hand when we have the designated time period, we'll allow you to raise your hand and speak directly to this two speakers. Pirooz loves combining his multifaceted experience as an artist, musician, writer, actor, and director to create new hybrids and innovations in storytelling. Formerly a neuroscience major, he fled that field and as well as an obedient first-generation immigrant. He broke free of tradition and gave heart attacks to Iranian parents everywhere by joining the musical group Cecil's Water and touring with acclaimed artists such as the Caulfields, the Toasters, Ruder Than You, Spindrift, The Verge, and others. Among his other films are Shoplifting from American Apparel, The Human War, Brad Warner's Hardcore Zen, Zombie Bounty Hunter M.D., Ctrl Alt Delete, and then his web series, Stories Between Iran and America. And then, of course, his latest documentary feature is Sometimes I Dream in Farsi. So welcome, Pirooz, John.
Thank you so much.
And Dr. Taghi Amjadi is a faculty counselor here at San Francisco State, and he's a wonderful human being, and we're so glad to have him with us. He's been working with a Bay Area multicultural populations in his private practice, as well as at San Francisco State with students, and he's been involved in a variety of community-based organizations since the mid-1990s. He's also been an adjunct faculty member at University of San Francisco and John F. Kennedy University. His concentration is in the areas of cross-cultural psychotherapy, trauma, and relationships. And he's the recipient of 2 awards from United States Congressman of the 7th District, as well as Contra Costa County Juvenile Justice Program for outstanding community support and services. And he's been involved in social justice activities since the 1970s. So thank you to you, Dr.
Thank you so much.
And I think it was a perfect pairing, because I think, Taghi, you've been involved with young people for a long time. So I know you've probably seen the effects of trauma and bigotry and racism among many of our students here at San Francisco State. And one final thing I want to say, if you had the opportunity to see the film, please do Pirooz a favor and fill out the survey that is in SurveyMonkey. The engagement team at PBS has been supporting Pirooz, and he would love it to hear from you directly on the survey. So Ariana will put that in the chat as well. So without further ado, I'm gonna let the 2 of you talk to each other, and I'll sort of monitor any questions. Thank you both.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Persis, for the kind and generous introduction. I also want to acknowledge your center, the Center for Iranian Diaspora, for all the great work that you are doing, and actually have transformed the work that is done with the community, Iranian community, and for the Iranian community. And also want to acknowledge the work that Pirooz has done, and I'm honored to be in communication and in the discussion about the great movie that he made. So I was going to actually start with a few comments. First, because of the work that I do, talking a little bit about immigrants and the usual psychological experience of immigrants, and a few points about that. Then I would ask some questions, and maybe we started chatting about the movie and about the aspects of the movie that it was really interesting to see and to talk about. So we all know that immigration, the experience of immigration is not an easy thing, and usually is involved with a lot of psychological experiences, including trauma and PTSD, and sometimes even suicidal ideation because of the distress associated with the separation, loss, and other adjustment issues. And there are components of the psychological issues, that one of them is socio-ecological issues, that when people come to the new country or new places, the environment, the local community, and the discrimination that people experience is affecting them and impact them. And the neighbor that they are living, I mean, the communities that they are living, the work that they are doing, the job changes, the language barrier, a lot of things, and also the discrimination that people experience, racism, xenophobia, and all of these phobia type that people experience usually brings some psychological issues and psychological difficulties. And another aspect is the acculturation process, and acculturation adaptation, which takes a long time. It's a process of of years that people experience, and it comes as a result of stage by stage, as a result of a lot of interactions, and which also causes sometimes mental health for immigrants. And at times the acculturation gap is causing difficulties between parents and children, which we experience actually, some of them in the movie. And also the process of eventually finding the trust, I mean, the social trust that people like Pirooz, who has gone through so much difficulties, eventually would be able to be active and functioning, successful contributor to the society. So yeah, these are some of the discrimination and racism that happens stays with people for such a long time. And we also know that racism and discrimination is there and is going to stay. It's not an easy thing to be eliminated. So the only way to reduce it and dealing with it is recognizing it and describing it and communicating it, and sometimes at the end taking some actions. And I'm glad that Pirooz took this action. It's an anti-racist action, the movie that you made. So I really want to congratulate you. It's a very educational movie. You're raising awareness and consciousness through this movie and promoting hope and hope for a more harmonious future for the younger, especially younger generation. And I really appreciated that. And just wanted to talk about that a little bit more during our question and answer. And also the most important part of it is actually you, through working for this movie and developing this movie, you have healed yourself. I mean, the wound that you have experienced throughout this immigrant life and the issues that you have been dealing with, you eventually were able, as you mentioned in the movie, you eventually were able to heal yourself through through developing this movie and making this movie, which movie making is a huge thing and is a really challenging and difficult job. I don't know much anything about it actually, but I know it's a really, really kind of difficult process. And you did that, and on the top of that, the bonus was that you healed yourself, which is amazing. And I was really amazed that you used different model of different orientation of therapeutic orientation, like drama therapy. Expressive art and drama therapy is a huge field now, but you were able to actually really greatly applying some of those techniques in your movie, which was really nice to see, and how it worked was really impressive. So so that was a gift, and you worked through this wound by making this movie, which was really amazing, and I wanted to make emphasis on that. And because no wound, as Rumi says, actually no wound would be healed unless it's witnessed. And now your wound, you express your wound, and you're open to talk about that and made a movie out of that. So it's actually witnessed by thousands, or maybe eventually hundreds of thousands of people. So I want to congratulate you about that. Then if you have anything to say, and then I have some questions for you.
Well, thank you so much for that introduction. I think that it's clear that it would have been such a great benefit to be with you as a child. And probably the first thing that comes to mind is for those people that experienced the film and it was difficult. Maybe I would encourage that they communicate with others or other mental health professionals like Dr. Amjadi, so that they have an opportunity to heal and be supported through that. So I think that's the first thing in my response, that I wouldn't advise everyone to, they experience something and make a film of it. And when I actually told my therapist, she said, no, you don't do this in a movie. Are you kidding? But, you know, she kept advising me throughout. And I really didn't know that I would heal myself in the end. And I think part of that idea of Rumi that you bring up about witnessing oneself, I think the other thing I was able to do was to keep a frame of not knowing. And that really, I think, is the heart of a lot of Rumi's statements. This idea of the unknown can sort of make things infinite, and you can access things that you wouldn't ordinarily. And once you think you know something, then it suddenly puts you in one category or another. And that not knowing, or even reading Sufi poetry, which I did a lot during the film, actually. I was reading a lot of Sufi poetry, oftentimes to just sort of create a place for myself that would be a clean slate, and then approach the film again.
Yeah, it was amazing. And the openness that you had, I think, was a key point to that. I mean, throughout the process, I noticed that you had some firm idea about how to approach the issue, and your father had some firm idea, and it was very different. But you were open to talk and listen. And so your father was thinking that racism, there is aspects of racism in us, or the response that comes from other people has to be, I mean, we don't have to do anything with that. And we have to look inside and make ourselves stronger, so we would be able to deal with the act of racism, which is one approach. And you had this approach of, okay, we have to bring it up, we have to confront it. It's a generational, multi-generational issues. Your parents are coming from different culture and still in the process of adjusting into the culture. So probably the wisdom of that culture mentions, okay, you have to develop tolerance about racism. And also maybe not feeling secure in the foreign country to express their true and honest views. And you are American, you are here, and you don't know much about all those accommodations or all these things that you want. That it comes culturally, and you have the right. You are American, you are raised here, you're born here, not born here, but raised here, and you want to be honest and confrontive and open to your ideas. And there is a conflict, and you were open and flexible to discuss the issue and eventually come up with some solution, which was really healing for the whole family and for yourself. So it's amazing that it worked out that way. So I have some questions written up here that wanted to, first of all, how did you come up with this role play therapeutic technique that, I mean, how did you convince yourself that you're going to use role play, which was really healing?
Yeah, it was. I actually, and I think Kevin Ramsey is in our Zoom audience, the incredible actor and colleague. When I had him in the film and he asked me about my apocalypse, in that moment that I broke down and suddenly remembered the traumatic incident when the barber refused to cut my hair and the police were involved and how chaotic it was. As soon as that happened and I was making a comedy, the very next day I went into therapy. I knew it was heavy, and I had never cried on a film or suddenly broken down like that. So I knew I needed to explore it. And it was actually the therapist's idea to do Gestalt therapy and actually do the first role play. Mm-hmm. So we did one together, and I played myself as the child, and then I played my father, and then I played the barber. And after we did that initial run through, I recognized the power of it. But also as a filmmaker, I thought no one has documented something like this. And immediately I thought, well, it needs to be documented, because what better way to show this incredibly complex thing than to actually witness someone going through that process. And as soon as I started thinking about that, then very quickly I started seeing that I could do this with everyone, with all of my family members, with anyone that I met, so that they could truly understand. And I think people often don't understand how traumatic or difficult that is for a very young child. They really don't have the ability to process it.
Right.
And so when my father said things like, just make yourself stronger, I didn't think this was a big deal, Pirooz. It's just no problem.
Right.
Just I go through everything myself. And, you know, I understand that. And I admire my father so much for his discipline and fortitude. But I knew that that wasn't an answer for people, and it certainly wasn't an answer to give to a child. So that's how the role play came about. And I thought, okay, let's start doing this and let's see where it goes. I really didn't know where it would go.
Yeah,
the film was the result. Yeah,
that was very creative. So did you have any person or any therapist or any someone in the background for processing after the shots, after the pieces that you did? Or?
Yeah, so that same therapist that I went to initially, I continued to see her, and I'm still seeing her to this day. So she's also seen the film and just so impressed by it, and just like you know, thinks that it's a great thing that I have done, not only for, you know, people that want to watch a movie like this, but also in her field as a therapist. And it offers this example for many that maybe can't afford to do therapy, or maybe they thought, especially as you know, in our culture and in some cultures, going to a health professional is considered taboo. So that's another thing that I wanted to sort of examine and let people know, well, if I'm willing to go through this and be vulnerable, if I'm willing to go through this event, then others might be able to as well. And if they can't afford it, they can watch me go through it and watch the film over and over again and then process in their own time.
Right, yes. Yeah, that was another contribution of the movie, that you kind of made yourself vulnerable and also opened up this stigma that is attached to going to therapy, especially in Persian community, that, okay, people can go to therapy and can talk to therapists and can consult with someone, or actually using some of these techniques. There is a drama therapist that they do playback theater it's called Playback Theater Center, I believe, Center for Art or something, and they do similar things, and so they go to the theater and ask people to talk about the trauma or difficulties or challenges, and they have some artists who are also therapists to play the same topic. And that by itself, even though it's not as extensive as the work that you're doing, but it is healing. So I'm glad that you are introducing this model of work, and also being open about this, and kind of reducing the stigma attached to going to therapy, and raising consciousness about the issue of racism, which is very important. That how people can be racist without knowing that for example, they are racist. Yeah. And how you mentioned about, for example, microaggression is a form of racism, but we don't consider it a racist act. I mean, and we all, as an immigrant, we all probably have one way or another experienced racism, or at least some microaggression that we didn't think is important, but it affected us deeply. And you brought those topics, which is sometimes people don't think is important, but it is important. It's a big part of our lives. And talking about microaggression, talking about all this racism and anti-racist act, how to be anti-racist. And racism, as we know, it has different forms. Like there is a biological kind of racism that people think that there is a gene, a special gene that they are more important than others. A special color is more important than other. Special class, special sexual orientation, special. And so this is a topic that you opened up, this possibility for conversation and communication among people to talk about all this, especially in immigrant families. And this film would be an educational medium for a lot of immigrant families, especially our Iranian culture. I mean, we need this type of work, and I'm glad you're doing that. So, how did you manage the acculturation gap between yourself and your father, for example, or your mom?
Well, it's something I think we negotiate from the onset, especially when you're young and you come from Iran and you're in America. Right away, you're put into a position where suddenly you become a translator, or you become the person that's sort of the bridge or the meeting point between Iran and America. And so I had been used to doing that. But I think the other thing is my willingness to listen. Mm-hmm. And it's something that I learned fairly early on in my 20s. At one point, when I was first going to move to Los Angeles with nothing. And my father, this is another, he got very worried, and he was sort of giving his worries. And suddenly I looked at him and I saw his face, and his eyes came into focus, and I really started listening to him. And I noticed that the more that I listened to him, the softer his voice became, the less aggressive that he was. And he suddenly started noticing that I was listening. And then he said, "What do you don't have anything to say? What is it? What do you want?" I said, "Dad, I gotta go to Los Angeles. I gotta be a filmmaker." And he said, okay, you go. Yeah. And so that was the first moment of recognizing how listening changes things. And then as I was making this film, I recognized the same power. That we're dealing with complex topics where people suddenly get emotional, or they have reactions, or they're afraid that they have somehow committed an act of microaggression, or they have been racist themselves, or whatever it might be. That the more that I actually listened to everybody, the more I was able to understand them, and the more they were able to understand me. Yeah, definitely. I noticed that listening to others, listening in the family, and also being open to discuss and challenging each other, but in a way that that at the end you are loving each other, and you want to go to the next step of being with each other and working with each other. So listening and working with each other, because we all have assumptions, and we all have our hidden biases, and we all have this racism that is inside of us, maybe a seed of it, or at least. But it doesn't get anywhere unless we actually work with each other and know each other. As soon as we make a separation between ourselves and other people and assume something, then we create these differences, we create this distance. And if we are in a narrow view moments of our life, then this can cause difficulties. I mean, the other thing I would say is probably along with that is the testament to my father. That because he was an data imaging scientist, from the beginning of my life, he told me to question everything. And he got me a book called Tell Me Why, and I would read it and look at the stars and ask every possible question. So I think that was a huge component to it as well, that his willingness to debate loudly, as he called it.
Right.
you know,
Right.
and maybe for me, I didn't need to debate as loudly as him. I would say, listen loudly. Maybe that would be my turn, my term instead. But I think that was incredible of him. And also my mother was willing to listen. And probably this other idea of generations that you see, I was very aware of it because my crew was much younger than me, you know? And so quickly I said to myself, not only do I want to have a diversity of people involved in the film, but I want to have a diversity of ages and perspectives. So very quickly, that's why I contacted my cousin Mina so that she could give her perspective. And then the crew themselves behind the camera suddenly speaking up. And so I said, okay, everybody can talk, you know? And then that really opened things up where everyone could sort of see their perspective and communicate to one another. Even though sometimes they didn't agree, I was concerned when it was happening, but I recognized afterwards that sometimes it has to be difficult before it's easy, you know, and therapy isn't always easy, just like meditation isn't easy or any of the things that we practice in the beginning, it can be very, very difficult, but I'm so glad that we went through it, you know, and I know that I am better for it, and I know that my family and I are better for it, and I hope that other people who watch the film can also get some benefit too.
Yeah, and it was interesting that your father, Brad, and you were saying that you had the same goal of working with this racism act and kind of bringing something out of it which would be useful, but you all had different approaches. Your father felt, and your father said a deep thing actually that I really was really interesting for me, that he said that we have different identities, and at different moment we react to different things, and unless we have the one identity, meaning like a magnetic center or some solid self, then unless we don't have, we get affected by this racist act, which is a good point.
Yeah.
That I mean, it was interesting for me to say that we have identity and we relate to identity at different times, but the one eye has not developed yet. Once we develop one eye, one solid self, then nothing can shake it, nothing can harm it that much, which is something that happens with wisdom, with years of experience, that he has gone through so much in Iran and here and all that. So he had this view, so he had his own truth from his own perspective, which was solid and valid. And you had your own experience, and yours was a little bit younger, and also wanted to fight for it and confront and move forward, and younger generation with the energy of younger generation. And his was a little bit more calming and different. But you all, and Brad too, from Buddhist perspective, he had some views that was interesting too. But ultimately, everybody was against racism and wanted to work something to overcome racism, but with different approach. And eventually, you brought it back together, and eventually, with communication, work together, and discussion, you all came to a good resolution of that, which was really nice.
I'm so glad that you recognized that, and that was my my favorite part of the film was those three perspectives and being able to honor all three. Right. That each of them had their own point of view, and it was valid for them. And if you remember towards the end of the film, there's also the recognition for me about how each of us had gone through different racial traumas at different ages. Exactly. And I also recognized that how they were dealing with their own traumas they faced actually dictated maybe their approach or how they would deal with things later on. So my father at 5 years old, or Brad at 16 years old, or me at 9 years old, we're all going to have different approaches that work for us, and we're all going to be able to process things at a different time.
Differently, yeah, exactly.
You know, And, you know, I think that was the other thing that was a great honor in the film, is that all three of them, even after the altercation, even after all the fights, were still willing to communicate. Even if we disagreed still, we still were there together. And that was made me feel very safe and loved.
Right.
And I also think that's a very important thing, that I think that we can all honor when we're having these types of discussions with each other. Like I showed the film, there was a screening and someone texted me after the screening. They didn't get to talk to me. They said, oh, the conversations we had in the car were amazing. You know, and I think that, yeah, you know, this film probably is going to create a lot of those things.
Right.
But my hope is that people could also be open to one another. And even though they disagree, to still be able to hear each other. And I think that's really what is going to get us closer to one another as we move forward through these next years.
Exactly, which brings me to the next question, which is about multiculturalism versus assimilation. So previously people were talking about the melting pot, that everybody comes to this culture, to this country, or they have to learn about the culture, they have to adapt with the culture, and they have to learn the values and be a member of the dominant culture. But recently, or the past couple of decades, people are talking about multiculturalism, that it wouldn't be like a melting pot, it would be like a salad bowl, that everybody has their own identity, unique identity, and they live together, coexist with each other. And you have developed that in that little microcosm of the bigger macrocosm, that your father, your mom, your cousin, Brad, and your brother, different backgrounds and different perspective, different age, different language at times. With Brad it's different language, but you were able to actually hold on to your identity and to your values and to your being and standards, and also being able to coexist and live with each other and accept each other the way that that other person is. So acceptance and seeing the person the way they are in a non-judgmental way, and also for a better goal of some standard, some betterment, like helping people to be the better version of themselves. So it was like it was a good gift to see this multicultural work, rather than kind of there is some people, white people or other people, that they are dominating the whole culture, and you have to adapt to their view or their values or their way of behaving, or whatever it is. So it was nice to see that as well.
Yeah, I'm so glad you saw it and it was there. And that's the way I've always felt. I've always felt like this multicultural person that is Iranian, is American, is all the places that I've been. And each person that I meet, I feel like it's an opportunity to meet someone new. And it's not necessarily their region or their ethnicity or their religion or anything that dictates who they are exclusively, but it's this, like you said, this salad bowl or meeting place where we can coexist. And I think probably one of the big factors of that is my parents were two different religions as well. So my mother was Muslim and my father was Baha'i. And to experience both of those, and also the Baha'i principles that talk about, you know, the elimination of racism and prejudice, and going into those communities and seeing that also had a huge effect. But probably the other thing is just being who I was at that time, in that era, interacting with so many different people, especially growing up in the international community at Purdue University when my father was getting his PhD, where every single person was different and all my friends were different. And maybe you can say something about this, but since that was the beginning of my life, from 0 to 5 years old was that kind of space, it's probably something that stuck with me. This idea of a world, really a worldview, and an approach that doesn't discriminate and doesn't judge. And I love that. I love being around every kind of person,
Yeah, it shows it from your work. So, did you feel any discrimination during this making this movie? I mean, by someone or some institution or some group or community?
I would say that when you're dealing with a topic like this at the time that I was making it, there are many people that were afraid to talk about race. They're afraid to talk about identity, but I wouldn't call it necessarily discrimination. It's just they didn't. It's sort of like how the discrimination often ends up happening. You're afraid of something, and rather than educating yourself about it, maybe it's easier to push it away or not to examine it or not to look at it. But for me, the sort of motto that I've lived by my whole life is, when you're afraid of something, face it. And especially in my artistry, that's something that I've always done. So whenever I've been afraid to make a film, that's the film that I make.
Yeah, it works. Yeah, thank you. So Percy-chan, do we have time?
Yeah. Lots of comments, a few questions. So if you don't mind, I'm going to read them.
Sure.
The first one is from Yamile Davoudi, who says, normally journaling and recording in the context of therapy is very personal. It was surprising that you produced a film going through your trauma. So it's more of a kind of observation, and I wonder if you want to say anything about your choice. I mean, especially, I think one of the things that's so impressive is that you just started therapy and you made a conscious decision to produce a film that resonates with your own process of doing therapy. Because usually therapy is a more private way of approaching things, and you kind of brought the internal process into a world where others can witness it with you.
Yeah, I think this is probably connected to you as well, in the sense of, writing stories or novels. So as I was approaching the film, I had to do it many different ways before I found the right path. So as you see from the storyboard behind me, that was my first level of documentation. So I had to draw it all out with pictures and then really encapsulate or inhabit the 9-year-old me. And so that's why the drawings I tried to do as a child, or to feel what that was. So it was almost like I was letting the child speak first. And then actually the film itself didn't include any of the storyboards. The first version of the film was all cinema verite. So I was not in the film at all. And it just went without any explanation or anything else. But then I spoke to several directors who were friends, and one of them suggested that, why don't I try to do something like a confessional and sort of start it that way? And that was the third iteration of the film. So once I started it, I recognized how it worked for the film, because some of the issues were so complex. And I also wanted to explore how the mind was working. How do we sort of take in judgment, and how do we approach it from different perspectives? And so the film became sort of almost like a way of talking in the confession booth or talking in a theater, like a soliloquy, and then to actually have the theater come to you. So it's almost like we were breaking layers. And this sort of goes into my idea of, and goes back to what Dr. Amjadi was saying about Rumi. And one thing that in Sufi poetry that I always admired was they said it was 7 layers that one needed to go through in a poem before they arrived at the truth. And so I started to think of the film as different layers or different contexts where we're breaking through those layers. So the storyboard or the animated film was one layer, but then there's the live action of me speaking. And then there's the idea of the reliable narrator themselves. Oftentimes when we talk about race, people are very quick to say, is that true? Or what was this? Or what was that? So I knew very quickly I needed to make myself a reliable narrator. So every time I said something, then you would see it in live action. Or that's why there were those repeated motifs when my father says, what should I do? You know, looking at the pine needles again and again, so that we're reminded of it. And almost, at least for me, since I was editing it, I also saw that I needed to go through it in my mind again. It's almost like I had to go through that wheel to actually come to that moment of transcendence for myself where I could be healed. I actually had to do all those gymnastics to get there. But I didn't know I would get there when I did it. Yeah.
Great. There's a lot of praise, and I want to make sure you know what people are saying. Thank you for daring to address this topic. Please convey our appreciation to your parents who were open to participating in the documentary. Lots of love to your father, I think, because people felt like he was such an open participant in your project. And I think Taghi pointed to this a little bit also, that you're addressing something that I think is an intergenerational problem among many Iranian families, that they don't have the language to talk about this, partly because they're raised in 2 very different contexts. But we could see this place where you were both meeting and struggling to find that language. And I think that was what was very moving, was your father's willingness to enter your world a little bit more, and your willingness to enter his world a little more, and then finding that, building that vocabulary a little bit in the process. So I think people were very impressed with your inclusion of your family, but in specifically your dad. And somebody said, Aman says, when your Baba said, we're just talking loudly, I couldn't help but laugh, thinking of my own Baba, which many of us know. Then another person commented on listening, and I want to read what Rona says. I understand what you're saying about listening, Pirooz, and I especially admired your strength to listen and be patient with your friend Brad. Although personally, sometimes I struggle with listening to people whose perspectives are actively unaccepting or hateful. How have you found space in yourself to extend that same patience and care that you have for your father to others as well, to people who may have more hurtful perspectives, such as Brad?
I think that for me, I recognized how powerful forgiveness was. And that if I could not forgive anyone who might have disagreed with me or had hurt me in the past or said anything, or even the people in my futures, right? I wouldn't be able to forgive myself. And I wouldn't be able to actually be able to come forward and be open and understanding and empathetic. So for myself, I recognized that that was the place that I needed to go. But I didn't know that I would find that until I had that sort of vision that you see in the end of the film, where I'm talking to my little brother and I'm sort of seeing these moments where I had these stories in my head that were registered very early that said, if you're different, you're going to be, you're Iranian, so you're going to be treated different. And if you remember, I'm sort of saying that again to my younger brother. And then you see me talking to my best friend, John and Jay, and John says, no, could only invite one person. We want to hang out with you. We want to play. And I think that, someone else said this to me after watching the film, that they felt like the movie was also about acceptance. And this feeling of feeling rejected sometimes can make it very difficult to forgive. But it's in those moments when you can recognize that if you hold on to this story that actually is an illusion, it's going to keep you from actually finding that forgiveness and finding that space to listen. Maybe that was a lot. I don't know.
Somebody asked a question, and I'm not 100% sure, but they said, what about blind spots? How to deal with blind spots? And maybe you have a question, a way to answer that.
What do they mean by blind spots?
Well, I don't know, but I think sometimes our own prejudicial perspective, or maybe we can't see. Like, one thing that might even, your film in some ways is about a personal experience, but when we think about racism, there's also the systemic and institutional ways that racism impacts people. That's much harder to deal with than a singular incident. And also, for, like, I appreciated, for example, that incident where you talked about your friends closing the garage, because in some ways you're eliminating the idea that once you have one experience of bigotry or racism leveled against you, sometimes you read the world that way, right? But what about people who have both the personal microaggressions or outright aggressive racism, and then they see systemic, for Black people, for example, they see absolute systemic exclusions. That could be a blind spot for you in making a film that is both, micro in its way of storytelling, but perhaps doesn't really include some of those people who might feel like, yeah, that's great to be forgiving, but what about all this? So I'm venturing that maybe that could be some way of addressing a blind spot. Maybe.
Yeah, for me, I was very aware of the systemic racism, and that's probably the big question that I sort of brought up to Brad, was understanding white privilege and things like this, and that we're consistently dealing with these types of things. And it's also something I brought up to my father as well. I think that it's very difficult to sort of deal with blind spots. And it's very difficult to deal with things that, is just prevalent and already a part of society. But for myself, I know that if I can at least start with myself, and if I can start with my family, then that's a place to build. And then that community goes outward. And maybe making a film like this gives an opportunity for everyone to start communicating about things that they don't ordinarily talk about. I think that talking about race, whether it's microaggressions or systemic racism, is something that's very difficult and emotional for people. So actually making this film, it puts a very, very bright light on these blind spots. And maybe if there are more films like this and more discussions, those blind spots can slowly become alleviated.
Okay, great. Rona says that I addressed it correctly, so I'm glad. Farzaneh says, re-narrating the past is considered a tool for the negotiation of a new identity in a new environment for diaspora and immigrant communities. How returning to the past, understanding several members of your family and other friends going through your trauma led you to a catharsis of the terrible feeling of trauma and negotiation, reconstruction of a new identity maybe after making the movie, going through role playing and the past memories. Did that make sense?
So was there a question there?
It
That
is
sounds
a
like what I
question.
went through. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. How did returning to the past perhaps help you to construct a new kind of Pirooz from it?
Oh. Well, there are many Piroozes that resulted, right? So there's one that as a filmmaker, I had always been looking for what was my voice. And so every year I would make a film from a different genre. And it was by going through this experience that I could clearly see how I needed to tell stories from here on out, because I think that I found myself. But it actually wasn't a new Pirooz. It was an integration of the child Pirooz within the adult Pirooz, that they could coexist together. And as far as going into the past came to me. I didn't expect the past to come to me, but it was witnessing what was happening down in the border and sort of the Muslim ban and Trump talking about it on TV and everything that we were going through as an entire country here in the United States that triggered the event, and then Kevin's question itself. So I didn't expect the past to come, but once it arrived, I had to deal with it. And I think that that's something that when you go through trauma, you can't really control it. You can only sort of bear witness to it, like Dr. Amjadi said, communicate about it, and potentially have some healing, whether it's through dialogues like this or through a therapist or through making a film.
Speaking of film, several people who joined us today haven't been able to see the film, and I want to be respectful of what it takes to make a film and what it costs to make a film. So we had it so that people could register and view the film within a specific time. So I want you to say a little bit more about, if people want to see the film, how should they go about it? And is this going to be broadcast anywhere? Or is it going to be distributed anywhere? So that, because I know that when you make a film, you don't want to just make it free to people right away. You want them to be paying customers, and I don't know what your plan is. So maybe you could address that.
Yeah, there are so many distributors that are interested in the film, and I've spoken to them. So we'll see which one takes it and whether it goes to a streaming platform or not. But right now it's actually still playing in festivals and winning awards. So I'm just going to sort of let it play out. But I am in talks right now with various distributors that are interested in the film. So I'll try to make sure that it gets to everyone as soon as I can. And maybe this link that they have, I can keep it open for a few more days. So
Okay.
anyone that wants to see the film through the Center for Iranian Diaspora Studies in San Francisco State has an opportunity to do so.
Okay, thank you. That's wonderful. So Ariana, maybe you could let people know how to do that. So it's a Vimeo, it's on the Vimeo platform. Can I say what the password is?
Yeah.
Okay. So if you look at Sometimes I Dream in Farsi on Vimeo and you put in the password Merci, M-E-R-C-I, the French spelling, you can watch it. And we encourage you not to share it with other people, watch it yourself, and then talk it up so that when it comes to a streaming platform, he gets twice as many viewers. How about that?
Yeah, that sounds good. And they're welcome to share it with others if they want. There's no restriction on it. And let me see if I can find the link, and then that way I can send it to everyone.
Oh, she just, Ariana just put it in the chat. So it's there if you want to watch it. You know, the best advertisement for a film is people talking about it. So, and I think one of the things that's wonderful is when it's a film, like you mentioned, the people texting you in the car to tell you that it's sparked a lot of discussion. I think that it is one of those films that, while it's unique and contextualized to an Iranian context, has a lot to do with other people. You know, I think many immigrant and diaspora communities would see themselves in this film. I'm going to ask you a question a little bit about context, because one of the things that I thought was so interesting was that you had no context for the 9-year-old Pirooz history-wise, right? So I'm like, okay, what year is this? Is this the hostage crisis? Is this 3 years after the hostage crisis? Is this, you know, and at first it bothered me. And then I realized as the film went on, you were trying to sort of take away the narrative that's so embedded in American consciousness about post-79 hostage crisis. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that decision, or was it a decision?
I didn't go too deep into it because I didn't think it was relevant necessarily to the 9-year-old me. And I just really tried to connect with what I enjoyed at that moment. And that was Scooby-Doo and Star Wars and Santa Claus, and sort of that's where it was for me. So to actually try and make a concerted effort to say, oh, I'm going to exclude it or not exclude it, it wasn't really part of the process. But I'm so glad that you picked it out, your brilliance to see it. And I'll just say, yes, that's what I did, you know, so.
Yeah. Okay, we have time for a couple questions. If anybody wants to say anything else, there's a couple comments, I'll read them. And if anyone wants to ask any burning questions. Thank you so much for sharing this story. I wasn't expecting to have such an emotional reaction, and I'm deeply moved by it. It resonates on so many levels. And another person said, I saw the movie, it's amazing. I had a similar heart-touching story happen to one of our friends who lives in the US and India. I would like to share and need some input on the story writing. Can I speak now? Okay. How about this, Siva Kumar? I think it would be really great if you emailed, because if it's about something you want to do in terms of story writing, I think it's probably better to communicate directly with Pirooz. So Pirooz, can we put your email in the chat?
Sure.
What is it?
PiroozKalayeh@gmail.com.
Okay, so PiroozKalayeh@gmail.com. I'm going to let you write to him directly, Siva Kumar, because I don't want to take up too much time. That sounds like a little bit of a filmmaker's conversation on the side. Is that okay?
He says thank you.
Okay, good, good. It's a he. Any other, let's see, any other questions? I have a question a little bit about the filmmaking style, because you used archival materials, family home movies, you use the sketching from the storyboard behind you, some of it animated. You used, you know, live action documentary, like it was a hodgepodge of filmmaking styles. And is that sort of what you consider your trademark? And what does that give you, either in terms of freedom or cost effectiveness in filmmaking, those choices to use that?
Well, the drawings I saw as serving two purposes. One, to sort of enact the 9-year-old me, but the other thing was there were moments where I didn't have footage, and I saw that I could animate it and do it very easily with this special technique that I found myself, and I could do it quickly. The other thing is that for myself, I've always looked at myself as an artist and not a filmmaker, but everyone else calls me a filmmaker. And so my loves are Keith Haring and Jean-Michel Basquiat, and sort of this idea of doing graffiti. And so I've always envisioned my films as paintings on movies. And that's why you'll see text on them or a different type of interaction. And I think the other thing is this flow between the different media arts also gives a way for people to enter different perspectives or to see things from different vantage points. So in a way, for me, it's kind of the way that I see the world. I see it like that, and so that's the way that I created it. I don't know if every film I do now is going to have animation, but I do love it very much. And I think that goes back to just a love for Disney and a love for Scooby-Doo and a love for integrating different medias together. There's also an excitement that when I can put all of these things together to tell a story, it doesn't look like anything else, but it looks just like me. And maybe that has something to do with the film almost as my own body, or as my own self, or maybe this idea of the new identity that was created, that somehow that there's this multicultural Pirooz, or there's this Pirooz that's both Iranian and American, but also there's all these different media types that represent Pirooz. And so I think that when you have people in diaspora, you have artists that are immigrants, I wouldn't be surprised if they're intermingling or commingling the media arts now today to represent those multicultural identities.
Thank you. That was really interesting. I also wanted to note that I think you are a documentarian from a very young age, because you talked about capturing things in film and cameras when you were a kid. And I think that's a really interesting part of your recording, right? That you recorded the memory of this traumatic event so vividly, partly because you had that sort of inclination to be a documentarian early on, you know, by using, you said you used I guess a home movie. So that was really
that was thanks to Mr. Cheeseman, my world history teacher, who, you know, and I guess that's what I always did. Whenever there was an opportunity to use a camera, I just always wanted to pick one up. But when he did that lesson on the civil rights movement, and just very quickly, I saw things visually, and that was just an easier way for me to communicate. You know, recently I went to a sound artist panel, and there was an African-American artist talking about how they couldn't find a way to deal with the traumas that they had or the systemic racism that they were dealing with, so that instead of actually painting anymore, they actually started taking recordings of things and then melting them down and then making those into records. And that sound, that scratchy sound, was something that they could actually say was their voice. And so in a way, I think that this sort of melding of the arts and things like that is also another way of finding voice, you know, and I think that's individual to everyone. And all of those storytellers and filmmakers that are out there, they're going to need to find those things, those little imperfections that make them what they are, and then to recognize that those imperfections are actually what makes them beautiful and wonderful. And then they're able to incorporate them and put them out. I'm sort of talking probably way past the question now, so now I've lost the question.
There is one more question from Nazi. She says, Pirooz, did you really mean it when you said you didn't know how to end the film, or was that an attempt to make us think about the message of the film?
No, I really didn't know how I was going to end the film. So there were moments where whatever I was documenting, I was really documenting. I was really racking my brain to try and see how this would end or where it would end. So when I asked my father at the end, and then he said, "You should end the movie like Princess Bride," that was really a real conversation, really recorded live, and that was his response. But I think the other thing that sort of Nazi is getting at is the process of making the film, right? There are certain things that I did want to include in the film that shows you how difficult it is to tell this type of story. So at the onset of the film, when you see me sort of coughing and drinking a soda and then starting, I recognized that people needed to see just how difficult this was. So that's something that I incorporated later, that I was like, oh, this is another layer I need to put in so that people can understand and really recognize this is not an easy thing to do. So there were other moments as I was going, after I put that initial thing in, that I said, okay, well, we need to put some other things that show how difficult it was throughout the film as well.
Yeah, I think, Dr. Amjadi, do you have any concluding remarks?
Yeah, I just wanted to ask you, what is next? What is next project, Pirooz?
My next film is called, my room in Tehran is called America.
All right. Okay.
And it's about a female Iranian artist who is basically trying to get out of Iran and live a life without censorship. And so it's something I've been documenting for the last 2 years. And it's been also a very difficult film. But I'm very excited to start a fundraiser in the next week or so and sort of see about different financiers coming through. But it's a film I hope to have done in a year, but as Persis knows, we don't know how long these things take. So maybe it's 2 more years, 3 more years, but that's the one.
That's great. That's great. Yeah, looking forward to see it. Yeah, so I just wanted to mention and acknowledge your effort, and our hope is in you and the new generations, that they are both wise, talented, and passionate about the artwork that you're doing, and working towards raising consciousness. Any consciousness that anybody raises in the world is all related. It affects the whole consciousness. So I'm glad that you are successfully doing this, and looking forward to the near future seeing other movies from you.
Oh, thank you so much. Thank you for your wonderful questions, both you and Persis. It's been a great experience to share this time with you. And I also want to acknowledge both of you for being able to see me and welcome me into this community that I've always wanted to be a part of since I read Persis's book, The World Between, and I knew there were other people like me. So it's a great value and a great privilege to be here with you and everyone that is here listening.
Thank you.
Thank you. And we look forward to seeing your film get distributed. I think it's really important that people pick this up, and it's a wonderful film on many levels, but educationally, it's really important for people to see this kind of thing, because we have so much work to do in this country around dealing with racism and bigotry and hostility towards immigrants and people of color. So I think it has a tremendous value for people to see it. So I wish you good luck with the process of getting a distributor, and thanks for sharing your afternoon with us.
Thank you so much. Yeah.
Thank you.
Open and honest heart.
Yes,
I appreciate
yes,
it.
definitely.
Thank you all so much.
Yeah.
Yes, thank
And
you.
thank you all for being with us. We appreciate the attention of the audience. We know that sometimes Zoom world can get tedious because you're looking at boxes instead of breathing the oxygen of togetherness, but it was a lovely opportunity to see some old friends and new. And we encourage you to follow us on our social media. We have some events coming up in June for Pride Month. We like to make sure that we honor all of our community members. So please feel free to join our mailing list and come back again, and take care, everyone.